On a small island in the Bahamas, tucked inside the grounds of one of the largest resort complexes in the Caribbean, there is a stone cloister that is 600 years old. French, medieval, carved by hands that had never seen an ocean this warm, for a monastery an ocean away. It did not wash up there. A man bought it, from a warehouse where it had been sitting in crates, once owned by another rich man who never got around to rebuilding it either. And then he had it shipped across the Atlantic, stone by numbered stone, and reassembled on a sand island he was turning into a private paradise. A 14th century French monastery, taken apart in Europe and put back together beside a swimming pool. You do not do a thing like that with ordinary money. You do it with the kind of fortune that feels less like wealth and more like gravity, the kind that bends the world toward you, that moves 6 centuries of stone across an ocean because you decided it should be closer. The man who moved those stones carried one of the great American surnames of the 20th century. His family had built something almost impossible to picture now, the largest retailer on the face of the earth. And tonight, I want to show you what almost no one tells you about that name, because this family didn't lose its fortune once. It lost it twice, in 2 completely different ways, decades apart. And the second time, almost nobody was even watching. To understand how far this family fell, you have to first stand inside how high it built, and the strange, almost monkish discipline that got it there. Because the men who made this fortune were not the men who moved medieval cloisters across oceans. They were very nearly the opposite. The name was Hartford. The business was a grocery company, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, a name so long that America eventually just called it by its initials, A&P. It began in the 1800s under a founder named George Huntington Hartford, who died in 1917, leaving an estate valued at around $125 million. But it was his 2 sons, John and George, who took a regional chain of tea and grocery shops and turned it into something the world had never seen before. And here's the part that matters, the part that tells you who these men actually were. They were relentlessly, almost comically frugal. There is a story from inside the company, and this one is well documented, that they were paying an outside supplier for baking powder until someone in the family took the trouble to have the formula analyzed. It came back as little more than baking soda and a common carbonate, cheap chemistry, sold to them at a markup they had simply never questioned. So A&P simply started manufacturing its own inside the store. Picture the mind that does that. A family running thousands of stores and still curious enough, still unwilling enough to be quietly overcharged to send a can of baking powder to a chemist over a few pennies a unit. That was the instinct running the whole empire. Trust nothing you haven't taken apart, spend nothing you don't have to, and pass every cent you save to the customer as a lower price and to the company as strength. John Hartford kept a permanent suite at the Plaza Hotel and a Tudor-style mansion up in Valhalla, New York. Comfort, yes, but nothing like extravagance. His brother George was described as being as frugal as their own mother. These were men who controlled one of the largest commercial enterprises in America and ran it like they were still one bad quarter from losing everything. Which, if you understand how fortunes actually die, is exactly the paranoia that keeps them alive. Think about what that frugality actually required, day after day, from men who could have bought almost anything. It is one thing to be careful when you are poor and have no choice. It is something else entirely to control a billion-dollar enterprise and still care, personally, whether you are overpaying for baking powder. That is not thrift. That is a discipline held on purpose, against every temptation, by men who understood something most heirs never learn, that the habits which build a fortune and the habits which spend one are not neighbors. They are opposites. And the moment you let yourself relax into the second, the first is already gone. Because discipline like that isn't a personality quirk, it's a machine. Every dollar not spent on themselves was a dollar the business could use to open another store, cut another price, absorb another shock. The frugality of the 2 brothers at the top wasn't stinginess, it was the engine. When a competitor cut a price, A&P could match it and survive, because A&P had spent the good years building a cushion instead of spending it on themselves. When a bad year came, they had reserves, because reserves were the entire point. And for a while, That engine built something almost no one in retail has matched before or since. The question that would eventually hollow this family out was never whether they could build the machine. They built it better than anyone alive. The question, the one hanging over everything you're about to see, was whether that engine could survive the moment the men who understood it were no longer the ones holding the keys. Because an engine is only as alive as the discipline of the hands on it. And discipline, unlike a building or a bank account, is the one thing a fortune cannot leave to anyone in a will. So let me show you the size of the thing they built, because the numbers only mean something once you can picture them standing up. By 1929, the year the American economy was about to fall off a cliff, A&P became the first retailer in history to reach $1 billion in annual sales. Not the first grocery chain, the first retailer of any kind, ever, anywhere. $1 billion in a single year, ringing up mostly in nickels and dimes across tens of thousands of small neighborhood stores, in an era when $1 billion was a fraction of the entire national economy. And the store count is almost hard to believe. At its peak, around 1930, A&P operated 15,709 stores. Some sources rounded up to 16,000, but hold on to the precise figure for a second, because 15,709 is a number that should stop you. That is not a company. That is an occupation. There were towns in America where the A&P was simply where you bought food, the way there was one church and one post office. For roughly 60 years, from around 1915 into the 1970s, A&P was the largest grocery retailer in the United States. And until 1965, it was the largest retailer in America of any kind, period. Not the largest grocer, the largest anything. Let that comparison settle, because it's easy to skate past. For a stretch of the 20th century, a company that sold tea and canned peas and flour was the single largest retailer in the United States, larger than every department store, every catalog house, every chain of any kind selling anything. In an age we remember for steel and oil and railroads, the biggest retailer in America was a grocer. That is how completely the Hartford brothers had woven themselves into the daily life of the country. Not a luxury, not an indulgence. Food, the one thing every single household in America bought every single week. And for decades, an enormous share of it passed across a Hartford counter. You want to know how big something has become? Watch who tries to stop it. In the 1940s, the United States government came after A&P directly, on antitrust grounds, the same weapon it reserved for the great monopolies of the age, the ones we still put in history books. There was an indictment in 1942, thrown out by a federal court in Dallas. Another indictment in 1944, a conviction in Illinois in 1945, upheld on appeal in 1949. The most powerful government on earth looked at a company that sold tea and canned goods and decided it had become too large to leave alone. Think about what it takes to earn that. Not a bank, not an oil trust, not a railroad. A grocer, pulled into the same courtrooms as the great monopolies, because it had grown into something the nation itself felt it had to check. That is the altitude we are talking about. That is the top of the mountain this family was standing on. And from that height, everything looked permanent. The stores were everywhere. The name was on every main street. The brothers who built it were disciplined, careful, still frugal, still in control. If you had stood in one of those 15,000 stores in 1930 and said out loud that within your lifetime the entire company would be gone, not shrunken, not merged, but erased, the name itself extinguished, people would have looked at you the way they'd look at someone predicting the ocean would run out of water. But fortunes this size almost never die from the outside. The government couldn't do it, the Depression couldn't do it, the competition for decades couldn't do it. Everything that could plausibly threaten a company of this scale threw itself at A&P and broke. What finally did it came from inside the family's own structure, and it began not with a crisis, but with something far more ordinary and far more dangerous, because no one recognizes it as a threat while it's happening. It began with a funeral. In fact, it began with two. Here is the thing nobody tells you about how great fortunes die. It is almost never the dramatic moment you'd expect. The crash, the scandal, the reckless heir. It is usually a quiet transfer of control that looks, at the time, completely responsible. a safe pair of hands, a trusted man. And by the time anyone understands what that decision actually did, the damage is 30 years deep and cannot be undone. John Hartford died in 1951. His brother George followed in 1957, and with them went the last two people alive who understood the engine from the inside, who knew in their bones that every dollar saved belonged back in the machine. Control of the company passed to a man named Ralph Burger. Now, Burger was not a villain. This is important, and it's exactly the kind of thing the internet gets wrong when it tells this story as a morality play. The reckless steward who wrecked the empire. That's not what happened, and the truth is more useful than the cartoon. He was a lifelong A&P man, promoted by George Hartford himself, loyal to the family and to the company. He was, by every account, a safe pair of hands. If you had to choose someone to protect what the brothers built, on paper, he was exactly who you'd pick. But watch what he was actually holding, because this is the mechanism. This is the quiet, structural thing that killed a company the government couldn't. Ralph Burger was, at the same time, president of the A&P and president of the John A. Hartford Foundation, the family's philanthropic trust, created back in 1929. Sit with that for a second, because the danger is hiding in the overlap. The foundation and the family heirs needed income. Income came from dividends. Dividends came from the company's profits. And the man deciding how much of the company's profit to pay out as dividends instead of reinvesting it in the business was the same man who ran the organization that needed those dividends. He wasn't stealing. He wasn't reckless. He was simply sitting in two chairs whose interests quietly pulled in opposite directions, and structurally, predictably, the money flowed toward the chair that needed it now. And this is the trap that almost no one sees coming, because it wears the mask of responsibility. Nobody in that arrangement had to be greedy for it to work its damage. Nobody had to make a single dramatic decision. The pull was built into the structure itself, a quiet, permanent tilt toward paying out today what should have been planted for tomorrow. A stronger structure would have put those two jobs in two different pairs of hands, with two different loyalties, precisely so that someone in the room was always fighting for the long life of the company against the short-term hunger of the people it fed. At A&P after 1957, that fight simply didn't happen. There was no one left in the room whose only loyalty was to the machine. So the profits came out of the company as dividends, year after year. And what does a retailer do when its cash is flowing out to shareholders instead of back into itself? On the surface, nothing. Nothing visible. The sales are still enormous. The name is still on every street. The dividend check's clear. From the outside, and even from most of the inside, the company looks exactly as healthy as it did the year before. And this is the trap. The thing that makes this kind of decline so much more dangerous than a crash. A crash announces itself. A crash forces a decision. But a company being slowly drained of the capital it needs to reinvent itself feels, from the inside, like success. Because the money is real. The dividends are real. The checks are cashed and spent and enjoyed. Everyone in the chain is being rewarded, right now, this quarter. The foundation is funded. The heirs have income. Burger is doing his job. Nobody is doing anything wrong, and everybody is being paid. And that is precisely why no one pulls the alarm. There is no alarm to pull. There is only a machine being quietly starved of the fuel that once made it unstoppable, by people who genuinely believe they are being responsible. But underneath, something was starting to rot, slowly, invisibly, in the one place no annual report captures. Because while A&P was paying itself, its competitors were building. Every dollar that left A&P as a dividend was a dollar a rival could spend on a newer store, a wider aisle, a bigger lot. And they did, relentlessly, while A&P stood still and called it stability. And the gap between what A&P was and what it was becoming would stay invisible right up until the moment it became the only thing anyone could see. Let me take you into one of those stores around 1970, because this is where you can actually see the rot. Not in a spreadsheet, but with your own eyes, in the physical world, if you knew what you were looking at. And almost nobody did. Picture two grocery stores on the same stretch of road. One is a competitor's. New, built that decade, wide, bright aisles, a big parking lot, the modern supermarket as we'd recognize it today. And next to it, an A&P. Smaller, older, narrower, dimmer. A store built for a different era and never fully rebuilt for this one. Here is the detail that should make the back of your neck cold. A&P had invented the modern supermarket format. In the 1930s and 40s, the Hartford brothers themselves had made the brutal, brilliant decision to close thousands of their small stores and consolidate them into fewer, larger ones. The store count fell from nearly 16,000 to around 6,000 in a single decade, and sales kept climbing, because it was the right move made by men who understood the machine. But that was the last great reinvention the company made. The men who had the nerve to tear down 15,000 stores because the future demanded it were gone. And the structure that replaced them, the dividends flowing out to the foundation, the capital that should have modernized the next generation of stores, going instead to the people who needed income, meant that A&P kept operating the supermarket it had invented 30 years earlier, while everyone else built the one it should have invented next. This is the cruelest part of how fortunes actually erode, and I want you to really see it, because it's the part almost no one understands until it's happened to something they own. The decline was completely invisible from the balance sheet for years. The sales were still enormous. The company was still, by revenue, a giant. There was no single terrible quarter, no dramatic collapse, no headline. There was just a slow physical falling behind, store by store, aisle by aisle, year by year, that you could only see if you stood in the parking lot and looked at the building. The numbers said healthy. The concrete said dying. And the numbers are what everyone watches. A widely publicized corporate reorganization in the late 1960s did not stop it. The 2 decades that followed were a long, grinding slide. Falling sales, closing stores, format experiments that didn't work, each one a little more desperate than the last. The company that had been too big for the United States government to leave alone was now quietly losing a race it had once defined. And the saddest part is how ordinary it looked while it happened. No villain, no crash. Just a great machine, still running, that no one was feeding anymore. And notice the cruel symmetry of it. Great. The willingness to tear down thousands of its own working stores because the future demanded a better format was the exact capacity it lost. The brothers reinvented the company by destroying the version of it that was currently succeeding. That takes nerve, and it takes capital, and it takes leaders whose incentive is the long life of the machine rather than this year's payout. Strip away any one of those three, and a company can still look enormous, still post huge sales, still dominate the map, while quietly losing the one ability that ever mattered, the ability to become the next version of itself before someone else does. And while all of this was happening to the company, while the empire the 2 frugal brothers built was slowly hollowing out from the inside, something else was happening to the family's money. A different branch, a different man, a different kind of fall entirely. Because the same surname was about to teach America a second lesson, one that had nothing to do with grocery stores and everything to do with what happens when you inherit the fortune, but not the machine that made it. I need to be precise with you here, because this is exactly the kind of place where these stories get told carelessly, and I don't want to do that to you or to the people involved. The man who moved the medieval cloister across the ocean, the man from the very beginning of tonight's story, was a Hartford. But he was not one of the brothers who ran the company. He came from a different branch of the family entirely. As though the world knew him as Huntington Hartford. His father, Edward, was a brother of John and George, but Edward was not an operating partner in the A&P. He was not one of the men in the store, analyzing baking powder, closing stores by the thousand. And when Edward died in 1922, his 11-year-old son Huntington inherited a personal fortune estimated at around $90 million, including the income from a trust worth roughly $1.5 million a year. $90 million to an 11-year-old boy in 1922. So hold the 2 branches side by side, because the contrast is the entire lesson. On one side, the men who built the machine, frugal to the point of manufacturing their own baking powder, pouring every saved dollar back into the business, disciplined by the daily reality of running it. On the other side, a boy who received the fortune the machine produced, but none of the machine itself. No stores to run, no payroll to meet, no brutal discipline of a business that punishes waste. Just income. Guaranteed, enormous, automatic income, arriving whether he did anything wise with it or not. The uncles woke up every morning owing something to a company. The nephew woke up every morning owed something by a trust. That single reversal, owing versus being owed, is the whole difference between a fortune that builds a man and a fortune that dissolves one. And this is the mechanism I most want you to understand tonight, because it is the quiet killer of inherited fortunes, and it looks nothing like recklessness. The discipline that builds a fortune is not a family trait that passes down in the blood. It's a behavior, and behaviors are taught by circumstance. The brothers were frugal because running the machine made them frugal. The machine demanded it every single day. Huntington Hartford was never frugal because nothing in his life ever required it to be. He didn't lack character. He lacked the one thing that had forged his uncle's character, the daily, grinding necessity of keeping something alive. You can't fake that necessity. You can lecture an heir about thrift, you can write it into a will, you can hand him every book on the subject, and none of it will do what actually built his uncle's, the felt, daily, personal weight of a business that will punish you tomorrow if you waste today. That weight is a teacher no amount of good intention replaces. Take it away, and you don't get a lazy man or a stupid one. You often get a talented, cultured, genuinely impressive man, who simply never had to learn the one lesson that the money itself depended on. Huntington Hartford was intelligent, artistic, and ambitious. He was also, from the age of 11, completely free of the only force that had ever made his family rich. Give a man the output of a great machine without the machine, and you have not given him wealth. You've given him a countdown. It just happens to be a very long, very comfortable, very beautiful countdown, and Huntington Hartford was about to spend it in some of the most spectacular ways a 20th century fortune was ever spent. He would build an island. He would build a museum out of white marble as a monument against modern art. He would hire the most famous architect in America, and piece by piece, decade by decade, he would prove something his frugal uncles already knew in their bones, that money without the discipline that made it is not a foundation. It's a fuse. So let me show you how a $90 million fuse actually burns. Not in a list of mistakes, but in the things he built, because the things he built were genuinely beautiful, and that's what makes this the saddest kind of fall. He wasn't a fool throwing money away. He was a man of real taste, spending a fortune on things the world simply didn't want as much as he did. Start with the island. In the Bahamas, there was a stretch of land called Hog Island, an unglamorous name for an unglamorous place. Huntington Hartford bought it and poured somewhere around $30 million into transforming it into a private paradise. He renamed it, of course. He called it Paradise Island. He built the Ocean Club, and this is the detail that tells you everything about the gap between his taste and his arithmetic. The Ocean Club had 52 rooms. 52. A luxury resort so small it was almost mathematically incapable of turning a profit. And for much of the time he owned it, there wasn't even a bridge to the mainland at Nassau. You reached this paradise by ferry. He built a jewel and forgot that a jewel that size cannot pay for itself. And it was here, on this island, that he installed the thing we began with tonight, a genuine 14th century French cloister, 600 years old, bought from a warehouse where it had once belonged to William Randolph Hearst, shipped across the Atlantic and rebuilt beside the sea. Think about what that object actually is. It is a man using the output of a grocery empire to move a medieval monastery across an ocean because it pleased him to be near it. His frugal uncles manufactured their own baking powder to save pennies. He imported 6 centuries of French stone to decorate a resort that couldn't fill its 52 rooms. Same fortune, same surname, opposite relationship to a dollar entirely. Then there was the museum. In 1964, on Columbus Circle in Manhattan, he opened the Gallery of Modern Art, a small, striking building sheathed in brilliant white Venetian marble, with an arcade of curved columns at street level that critics would nickname the Lollipop Building, and rows of small, round porthole windows running up its sculpted curve. He built it to house his collection, but really he built it as a manifesto, a deliberate monument against abstract modern art, a shot fired directly at the Museum of Modern Art a few blocks away. He was so committed to his taste that he constructed an entire marble building on one of the most valuable circles of land in New York to argue with a movement. The gallery closed 5 years later. 5 years. He also, at one point, hired Frank Lloyd Wright, the most celebrated architect in America, to design a sports club and resort for him in California. It was never built. The drawings survive in an archive. The building only ever existed on paper. There were others. He put money into a newspaper. He even started an oil company that, decades later and long after he'd left it, went on to real, lasting value under other people entirely, one of the very few things he ever touched that outlived his own involvement, though of course he was no longer there to benefit when it finally did. And a pattern hides inside all of it, the same pattern every single time. He had the vision to start remarkable things, and none of the discipline to stay and find out whether they could ever sustain themselves. The starting was the pleasure, the sustaining was the work, and the work was the one thing in his entire life that his fortune had never, not once, required him to do. Do you see the shape of it now? Every single thing he built was real and beautiful and almost right, and none of it was disciplined by the one question his uncles asked about every nickel. Does this feed the machine, or does it just please me? An island resort too small to profit. A marble museum built to lose an argument. A masterpiece by the greatest architect alive that never rose off the page. He wasn't burning the money on nothing. He was burning it on genuinely magnificent things that could not, would not, ever pay him back. And a fortune spent on beautiful things that don't return is spent exactly as completely as a fortune lost at a card table. The view is just better on the way down. And so we arrive at the bottom, both bottoms, because this is the part where the two branches of the same family, the company and the man, finally reach the ends of their two very different falls. Watch how differently a fortune can die, even when it carries a single name. The company went first in slow motion and last in the headlines. The long, grinding decline finally reached its conclusion in our own century. In 2010, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, the first retailer in history to sell $1 billion in a year, the company too large for the government to ignore, filed for bankruptcy. It reorganized, emerged, tried again, and in 2015 it filed a second time, the kind of second bankruptcy so common it has a grim nickname in the trade, Chapter 22. This time there was no reorganization. This time it liquidated. At the moment of that final filing, the company still operated nearly 300 stores under a scatter of brand names most people never even connected to A&P anymore. And then, at the end of 2015, the name that had been on 15,709 storefronts, the largest retailer on earth, simply stopped existing. Not shrunk, not sold intact, erased. But the man, Huntington Hartford, the one with the island and the marble and the cloister, his fall came quieter and earlier, and if anything, it's the one that will stay with you. Around 1992, and I'll be honest with you that the exact date is not perfectly documented in the sources, only that he was 81 at the time, the heir who had inherited $90 million filed for personal bankruptcy. Not to restructure an empire, not in some grand financial collapse. He filed, according to the reporting, to stop a single bank in Boston from auctioning off his house in Manhattan. The court filing listed assets of around $4 million against debts of roughly $200,000. Sit with the smallness of those numbers against where he started. $90 million inherited by a boy of 11. And 70 years later, an old man in court over a single house and a $200,000 debt. $200,000. To the boy who inherited $90 million, $200,000 was a rounding error, a number too small to have ever crossed his mind. To the old man at 81, it was the thing that nearly took his roof. That is what the end of a squandered fortune actually looks like. Not a dramatic collapse, but a shrinking, until the numbers that were once beneath your notice are suddenly the numbers that can break you. The fall isn't the crash. The fall is the slow inversion of scale, until small money becomes enormous because there is so little left. Two falls, same surname, and almost no connection between them except the name itself, because that's the truth the tidy versions of this story miss. The company didn't fail because of the island. The island didn't sink because of the company. These were two separate branches of one family, and each one died of its own disease, decades apart. The company died of a structure that drained its strength while it looked healthy. The man died of a fortune handed to him without the machine that could have taught him to keep it. One was killed by a spreadsheet no one read correctly. The other was spent on a French cloister and a marble museum and an island that couldn't fill its rooms. And here's what makes the whole thing land like a stone. Neither fall looked like a fall while it was happening. The company posted enormous sales right up until the slide became undeniable. The man lived beautifully, surrounded by genuine treasures, for decades. From the outside, at almost every single moment along the way, both the company and the man looked exactly like what old money is supposed to look like: permanent, secure, untouchable. The falling had already started. It had started years before anyone with the power to stop it was willing to admit what they were looking at. Which raises the only question that actually matters tonight, the one you should be asking about anything you're building. What did any of it leave behind? Let me take you back to where we started, because the answer to what survives is written, physically, in the two places we've already been. Go to Columbus Circle in Manhattan today, and the Marble Museum is still there. Except it isn't. In 2006, the building was gutted and radically redesigned, and the original brilliant white marble facade, the lollipop columns, the porthole windows, all of it, removed. Completely. The building that stands on that spot today houses the Museum of Arts and Design, and it is, physically, almost unrecognizable as the thing Huntington Hartford built. Same plot of land, same purpose, more or less, art, and yet nothing you would actually recognize as his survives on the surface. His monument against modern art became a museum of modern art and design, wearing a different skin entirely. The land remembered him. The building forgot him. And the island. Paradise Island, the 52-room resort that couldn't turn a profit, the sand and stone he poured $30 million into. Go there now, and you'll find one of the largest resort complexes in the Caribbean, the Atlantis, with its water parks and its aquariums and its casinos, built on the foundation he laid and sold. His paradise became someone else's fortune, and somewhere on those grounds, still standing, that 600-year-old French cloister remains. The medieval stones he dragged across an ocean, now a quiet curiosity that most of the tourists walking past have no idea belonged to a grocery heir who lost almost everything. And then there is the last detail, the one I saved for the end, because it's the whole story compressed into a single fact. When Huntington Hartford died in 2008, at the age of 97, after a lifetime of spending, the island, the museum, the homes in Palm Beach and London and the French Riviera, the fortune that dwindled from $90 million to a bankruptcy over one house. When he died, according to his daughter, there was still an untouched trust of $11 million that he had never once drawn from. A last quiet remnant of the original Hartford money, the money the two frugal brothers made selling tea and canned goods, sitting there intact at the very end. He spent a lifetime and a fortune, and the discipline of the men who built it reached him anyway, in the form of one account he never learned how to open. So here's what I want you to take from this, not as a lesson about grocery stores or dead billionaires, but about whatever you are building right now, at whatever size. The fortune was never the thing that lasted. The company vanished. The mansions passed to strangers. The marble was stripped off the building. What actually survived the Hartfords was not their money. It was the discipline that made it, and it survived exactly as long as someone was still practicing it. The moment the machine passed to people who wanted its output, but not its demands, the countdown started, in the company and in the man, at the same time, in two different ways. Ask yourself the honest question, the one this whole story is really about. If everything you've built were handed to someone who inherited the result but never learned the discipline that made it, how long would it last? Because that, and not the size of the fortune, is the only thing that has ever decided whether a name endures or just becomes a plaque on a building someone else now owns. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, not how to get rich, because that was never what this channel is about, but how real wealth is actually kept, and how quietly it slips away, then subscribe, because we take apart exactly these families, one at a time, every single week. Next time, we walk through the doors of the homes old money spends fortunes making sure you will never photograph, and why the house itself is a code you were never taught to read. Bless you.